in a trauma where there's something really significantly life-threatening, or perceived to be, it sort of freezes inside of our brain. It takes a snapshot. Our brain almost gets stuck in a certain mode. And in a lot of ways, those reactions become stuck in time. And so even though we move on past the trauma, that's why we say it's post-traumatic disorder. It's a way that our brain is operating as if we were in the moment, still being threatened or still in danger. Hey there, all right, thanks for joining me. I'm really happy you're spending this time with me, and I've got a lot that I want to open up for you. I'm recording a little series here for mental health awareness, but these topics are really important, and they're going to be really important for any time. So it doesn't matter what month it is, it doesn't matter what specific focus there is going on. These are episodes to really bring together the integration, this perspective of integration, and I think that there's so much that needs to be added to this conversation. So what we're talking about here today, this isn't obviously a full explanation of everything there is to say, but I want to go through and talk about different psychological, I'll say, disorders or sort of experiences that we typically think of as disorders, and that in itself, I think opens up a whole nother topic of conversation, how we conceptualize these human experiences. And so for the next few episodes, I'm just going to take one at a time, going through different kinds of disorders or issues that people face. So today I want to break open trauma. Trauma is a very common experience, whether we're talking about something that's diagnosable all the way on one end of the spectrum, or little mini traumas, lowercase t traumas of things that happen in people's lives. I'm going to use the sort of more extreme version of a sense of trauma to open up sort of a fuller understanding of how our biological, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of our being all sort of overlap and relate to each other, how they relate to each other. So this was actually my dissertation that I wrote in my for my doctorate, and I was looking at a Catholic conceptualization of a trauma model. And the reason why I started with trauma is because in the literature, there's something called complex trauma. And complex trauma is a conceptualization that takes into account these four dimensions of the human person, the bio, psycho, social, spiritual dimensions. Even in the secular literature, they talk about how a person's worldview and sense of, of course they have to say like the universe or spiritual, whatever, spiritual well-being, how that's affected by trauma. But the way that conceptualization of complex trauma is drawn out is they actually do look at biopsychosocial and even spiritual issues. And what they realized was, there's one guy that by the name of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who, with a bunch of other people, started to realize that some of their patients that they were getting, whether they're for eating disorders or anxiety disorders or addictions, started to have a diagnostic sheet that was pages long, and they had all these different individualized diagnoses. And what they started to realize is, instead of having this piecemeal perspective, why not figure out if there's some general conceptualization that makes sense? And once we start to realize that there are physical issues that happen and they coincide with the psychological issues, and then they coincide with family dynamics and relational issues, and then they started to look at, what do these people think about God or the universe or their spiritual life or whatever, they realize like there are patterns that are emerging. And a lot of times, a PTSD case where we're looking at sort of like a very specific trauma and a specific set of circumstances and symptoms as a result of those traumas coincided with all of these other issues. And then there were other patterns that emerged, especially when a trauma occurred for somebody at a younger age, when it was repeat offenses of trauma, and when there were, especially when there were people involved who were very close, whether it was a family member or somebody in the neighborhood or a teacher or some situation like that. So, and then when those variables were in play, then they could see that these other dimensions were present, and really it creates a really good paradigm and a lens to look through, really at all trauma, and really at the sort of quote-unquote trauma of being human. And really, if you think about concupiscence, the original sin is a kind of trauma. And we can take this step back and see that through this lens, we can understand ourselves really well. So in talking about this, the disclaimer, obviously, I'm not trying to give you tools to self-diagnose anything. I'm not, I'm certainly not providing this as a kind of therapy or anything like that. But these are just things to think about in terms of other people who you might know have been traumatized in some way. If you've dealt with something in your life, take this slowly, and just know that that's what we're talking about today. And it's just, I think, really good to know that in general for people that you might deal with in your life. And then, like I said, as a lens to understand sort of the bigger picture of integration and what these different dimensions, really bring to the table. So trauma, when something traumatic happens, we tap into our fight or flight system. And when that fight or flight system is triggered, a cascade of reactions happen from the brain, from our perception of that threat, and it's our survival mode. It's our self-protective way that by God's design, He created us to be able to protect ourselves, to either run or fight or freeze is another way to look at it. So depending on a lot of different factors, we'll go into one of those modes. And in a trauma where there's something really significantly life-threatening, or perceived to be, it sort of freezes inside of our brain. It takes a snapshot. Our brain almost gets stuck in a certain mode, and in a lot of ways, those reactions become stuck in time. And so even though we move on past the trauma, that's why we say it's post-traumatic disorder. It's a way that our brain is operating as if we were in the moment, still being threatened or still in danger, even though time has gone on and we're no longer in that situation anymore. So a lot of times, this is why mindfulness practice is a really good preparation for working through trauma, because what we're doing with the mindfulness practice is bringing our awareness to the present moment. And when we're doing some memory work or going back into trauma that happened in the past, we want to have one foot still in the present. And that's why that mindfulness is a good preparation for doing work in looking back at the past, because somebody with a traumatized brain, with trauma that they've gone through, both feet go back to the past whenever there's a trigger. And we just sort of get lost in a brain state as if we were still experiencing what happened in the past. And keep that in mind, because when we're starting to break open here what these effects are, realize that this is what's actually happening for somebody. When you see somebody acting a certain way whose life is being threatened, it makes sense. When you see like really disturbing images of people, fighting for or running for their lives, we all have been traumatized in a sense from 9/11, some people more directly, but some of the images that we saw of some of those things that people were doing to save their life, from the burning buildings, it's like, this doesn't make sense in any other way to think about it, except that you realize that they're actually their life is in danger. And then it does make sense. But that brain state is recreated for people who are traumatized in an ongoing way. You think about the sort of war veterans who are traumatized, and they, jump when they hear a loud bang. It's like when you're just walking down the street and there's a loud bang from like a car, that's maybe not understandable to be diving behind a garbage can. But if you're in Vietnam and there's a loud bang from a gun exploding or a bomb, it does make sense to jump behind a tree or something. So we have to keep that in mind to realize that people are bearing traumas, and we don't know what their brain states are actually like. And those are physical expressions of life-saving that I just I just gave example of, expressing how, we're, jumping away from fire or jumping behind a tree. But there are also psychological and social and spiritual consequences from trauma as well. So the most immediate physical is that anxiety response, that trauma response, that fight or flight, super increased heart rate and blood pressure, and blood is rushing out to your muscles for running or for fighting, or to stay in this freeze state. And then there's psychologically and mentally, all of our faculties zoom in on one point of that perceived threat, and we lose a sense of everything else around us. Now, this is really the sort of entry point for going much deeper in the Catholic mindfulness practice. But just to understand here that zooming in takes our faculties and severely limits them, so that we don't see the big picture. We don't have empathy. And that's why, like, people running, like, you see the stuff from the videos from the stampedes. I had in mind watching these videos of around Christmas time, when the news reports of, like, people storming for, like, whatever it was, Tickle Me Elmo or Xbox 360 or whatever. And you just watch people, running for their lives to get out of the way of these stampedes, and then you see people like throwing people out of the way, and it's crazy when you think about it. But like, we don't have the perspective in our brains in those times of life-threatening stress to think about other people. That's just not built into our biology. And certainly we can train in those areas, but and try to develop it, but that's the biological natural response. And that goes into the social, where we're really just only super focused on ourselves. It's really about safety. It's about survival. And so a lot of the dynamics of relationships that develop are built on self-protection. And so if a person has this sort of trauma structure and this trauma atmosphere in their brain, then that can carry over into a lot of areas of life. And, the examples I gave of those acute traumas of 9/11 or of war, those are acute traumas. Those are specific things. But there, again, are experiences that people have of a pervasive, even relational trauma, things that happen over a period of time that develop an atmosphere of fear and distrust and constant wondering and fear and an unknowing of what's happening and what's going to happen, and constantly being on edge. And that creates the same kind of brain state, but instead of it being sort of isolated into this one crystallized moment, it's spread out over time, which makes the post-traumatic brain state even more spread out over time. And that means it's even more pervasive, getting into all different relational dynamics. So maybe it's not just afraid of one perpetrator, but now afraid of everybody, especially anybody that's going to hold any kind of power over our emotional life. And that could be in romantic relationships, that could be in work relationships, that could be in a lot of different experiences of being with other people. And then ultimately, there's the sense that all is not well in the world. And this is where the peace with God comes in, because obviously God's promise to us is that all will be well. And God also shows up in the trauma of our concupiscence, of our life here on earth in sin, and says, yes, I know all is not well right now, but all will be well, and you can trust me. And in fact, I make all things new. So all things, it's like that beautiful scene from The Passion of the Christ when he's in the dirt on the way of the cross, and he's seeing Our Lady there, and they lock eyes, and he says, behold, I make all things new. And he's saying, even this moment right now, this terrible trauma, this terrible pain, this terrible suffering, I am transforming, and all will be well because I can make all things new. And a lot of times we talk about trauma and people ask me like, well, if I can get over the responses, the brain responses, how does that make sense? Like, I'm never going to forget what happened. And even with 9/11, never forget, never forget. We are never going to forget, and we can't forget. And sometimes people who have suffered that trauma want to forget, especially when they're in the midst of that kind of pain. They can't imagine a world of being free where they don't forget. But this is the beauty, and I bring Christ into this in this trauma work because in the resurrected body, he still has his wounds, and he shows Thomas his wounds, and the full culmination here, and what we want to see is what God is showing to us and showing us his wounds in the resurrected body of Christ. He's saying, this actually happened to me. This resurrection that you're witnessing, this victory over death, is an actual victory over actual death. I'm the Jesus who died. I'm the Jesus who was traumatized. And I've transformed it. And now it's a story of glory. Now it's a story of victory. So we don't want to forget, because It's like if Jesus showed up and his body was like perfectly renewed so that he doesn't have even the signs of the crucifixion anymore. It's almost like, that's kind of like Jesus 2.0. It's like the new version of Jesus in his like perfect body that doesn't have these wounds. But by maintaining those wounds, it's like he's saying, I'm not Jesus 2.0. I'm Jesus. Just Jesus. The Jesus who was killed is the Jesus who went to hell and the harrowing of hell and restored hope. And it's the Jesus who rose again from the dead, and the Jesus who's before you now in the resurrection of this body and inviting you into the resurrection of your body, if you'll join me. So he's joining us in our suffering so that we can join him in his overcoming of that suffering. So in a sense, the memory of trauma provides that same glory. So that when we do resolve and overcome that trauma, we look back and we can say, how good is God? How great is God? How glorified is God? Glory to God in the highest. He has He has overcome my trauma. That stuff that I can still remember actually did happen to me has been overcome by the grace of God and His greatness. And I stand here before you today, healed, resolved of this trauma. That brain pattern is no longer recurring in my brain. My loss of trust in others has been restored. My sense of well-being in this universe has been restored. My ability to open up out of this acute focus on a perception of a threat that's going to take my life has been restored. My biological responses to my life being threatened have been diminished. Now I know here I am in this present moment where my life is not being threatened. My brain has been healed. My heart has been healed. My psyche, my spirit has been healed. Praise God. And you can remember those things actually did happen, and this is actually your story. So this is the sort of trajectory, and then this is again an example. Not everybody has suffered complex trauma. Not everybody has suffered acute trauma, but we all have suffered some trauma of sin in our world, whether it's other people's against us, whether it's our own, which is ultimately against ourselves. And it's really important to see that this is all brought together and healed through God's grace. All right, I hope this has blessed you, maybe opened up some questions, which is certainly okay. And always feel free to shoot those over to me. And you can find us in iTunes. You can share this episode with somebody that you think might be blessed by it. And as always, please leave a review or a 5-star rating. And we really appreciate your help in our spreading this mission of integration, of helping people to bring together the spiritual life with the true reality of our humanity through this psychological lens, through this biological lens, understanding the truth of the incarnation, that we are made in God's image and that we are brought to glory through starting from our humanity. All right, God bless you.